So good morning, everyone. My name is Daniela Vintila. Thanks a lot, Ludger, for the introduction and also for the invitation to attend this very timely lecture series. I hope it's going to be very useful for our students, but also for many of our colleagues. And also thanks a lot, of course, to Gubilai for taking care of all the technical arrangements which made this lecture possible. So as Ludger was mentioning before, today we are going to focus on the policy measures that were taken by the European Union, but also some EU member states for EU citizens abroad during the pandemic. Now, of course, that this pandemic represents a major challenge for policymakers worldwide. It is clear that it has put into question states' preparedness for crisis management, but it has also raised at the same time very important questions regarding how states behave or protect their citizens abroad in a situation of emergency, such as this one. So we are going to talk today about this question. We are going to tackle this question of governmental responsiveness for the diaspora in times of pandemic alert. And this is basically the outline of our session today. So as you can see, I will start with a very brief introduction or contextualization regarding the diaspora populations of EU member states. And then we are going to discuss a little bit more about the policy measures that were taken for this specific group of the population during the pandemic. And in this regard, I'm going to focus on two aspects in particular. On the one side, we are going to briefly discuss about the reaction of the European Union. In particular, we will look at the case of repatriations of EU citizens stranded abroad during the pandemic, and in particular, the repatriations that were conducted under the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. And then in the second part, we are going to briefly discuss as well about the responsiveness of some national governments in Europe. And in particular, we are going to look at two case studies, Romania and Cyprus, which are actually very interesting case studies because they also represent two EU member states that count with a quite sizable diaspora abroad. And in terms of the sources that we are going to use for this, so some of the information that I will be sharing with you today comes from the ERC-funded project MITSO-PRO, Migration and Transnational Social Protection in Post-Crisis Europe, the one that Ludger mentioned at the beginning. So this is a project that we are currently conducting at the Center for Ethnic and Migration Studies at the University of Liège here in Belgium. And some of the information that I will present today, especially some comparative analysis that target all EU member states, come from this project, and in particular from these three books that we will publish soon with Springer in open access, and all three of them are co-edited with my colleague Jean-Michel Lafleur, who is also the PI of the MITSO. However, in addition to that, I'm going to present you also some preliminary findings from a new project that we have recently started. It's actually a project that focuses specifically on the topic of our session today. It tries to analyze how different EU member states have responded to this crisis, in particular for their nationals abroad during the pandemic, what type of measure they have introduced for their diaspora. So for the second project, I'm collaborating with several colleagues from the MITSO-PRO project with Jean-Michel Lafleur, Angeliki Constantinidou, Félicien Deheuch, Jérémy Mandin, and Carole Benger. But also we are collaborating with other colleagues from abroad, such as Inci Jenner-Rödenburg from Germany and Nicolas Stanek from Spain. Now, of course, we've just started this project, so therefore the data collection is still ongoing. So hence, what I'm going to present today are actually very preliminary findings that we have so far from the case of the European Union, but also from the two case studies that I mentioned before, which are Romania and Cyprus. Now, this being said, let's have a look at some comparative data regarding the diaspora population of EU member states. And in here, I probably wanted to make three remarks regarding the size, but also the demographic concentration of this group. I believe that these remarks are important because they could help us better understand or better contextualize why some countries responded the way they do to their diaspora populations during the pandemic. And the first remark that I wanted to make is actually something pretty obvious, which is that emigration is not an equally salient phenomenon across the EU. And of course that in an emergency situation, the pressure for protecting the diaspora might be stronger or might be weaker, depending as well on the size of this particular group. And in order to illustrate this point, in here we have, for instance, a map of all EU member states according to the share of their diaspora from the total population. And in here we see some interesting variations. We see that the relative size of the diaspora varies quite a lot between different EU member states. We see that in some cases, the diaspora represents less than 5% of the total population. These are the countries that are colored in this map in light blue. This category includes cases such as Spain, France, or Italy, for instance. We a priori know that the number of citizens of these countries who are residing abroad is very, very high, but so is the total population that they have is very large. So therefore, in relative terms, the size of the diaspora is a little bit smaller in comparative terms. And then we also see another cluster of countries, for instance, those that are colored in darker blue. These are the countries for which the diaspora actually represents 10% or more of the total population. So in this cluster in particular, we see, for instance, countries such as Ireland, Portugal, but also Cyprus. So these are countries that have started to witness substantial migration outflows for a long time now, for many decades. But within the same cluster, we also see countries that have started to experience substantial emigration waves much more recently. For instance, some of the Central and Eastern European countries, with Poland, Romania, Bulgaria being interesting examples in this regard. Now, the second remark that I wanted to make is actually regarding the demographic concentration of the diaspora populations of EU member states. Once again, I believe that this is an important point that we should keep in mind, especially because where the diaspora concentrates could also help us better understand the reaction of the states towards the specific segment of the population. So in this graph, for instance, on the horizontal axis, we see exactly what we've seen in the previous map, namely the percentage of diaspora from the total population of each EU member state. However, on the vertical axis, we see the percentage that the diaspora represents from the percentage of diaspora that resides in other EU member states from the total diaspora of each EU country. And in here, we see some interesting findings, I believe. So, for instance, we see that in many cases, when EU citizens decide to live abroad, to reside abroad, in many cases, they move to other EU member states. So they become intra-EU migrants, mobile EU citizens, they move from one EU country to another. And for instance, we see that in the case of all the countries that are listed in the upper part of the slide, above the red line, we see that more than a half of the diaspora populations of these countries actually resides in other EU member states. And in the cases of Belgium, Finland, Luxembourg, Romania, or Slovakia, we are talking about more than 75% of their diaspora which resides in other EU member states. And altogether, we also see that we have around 8 EU countries whose diaspora populations mainly concentrate in non-EU countries, in third countries. And the third remark that I wanted to make about this is the fact that the diaspora populations of EU member states generally tend to concentrate in a handful of destination countries. Again, I believe that this is an important remark that we should keep in mind because especially in a situation of emergency such as this one, some countries might be more prone to adopt some sort of tailor-made policies, if you wish, that apply particularly for the destination countries that host the most sizable diaspora communities. And in this table, for instance, we see the top 5 destination countries of the diaspora populations of each EU member state. So let's have a look at the findings. We see, for instance, cases such as Ireland, Finland, or Slovakia. We see that more than a half of the diaspora population of these countries is actually concentrated in a single destination country. And on the other hand, we also see that there are several EU member states for which more than a half of their diaspora actually concentrates in 2 destination countries in particular. Examples in this regard could be Austria, Croatia, Greece, Poland, among other countries as well. Now, of course, I believe that it is also important to highlight the fact that these figures generally refer to individuals who took up residence in another country. However, during the pandemic, many EU member states were also confronted with the challenge of responding to another specific segment of their nationals, meaning those who were stranded abroad during the pandemic without having residence in another country. They were tourists, for instance. They were people who were traveling abroad for a very, very short period of time, for business, for medical purposes, and so on and so forth. So these represent another specific segment of their population that could have been in need of protection during the pandemic. So this being said, let's have a look now at the policy measures that were adopted for the diaspora population of EU members. And we a priori know that, of course, Europe was very much affected by this pandemic. However, we also know that some EU member states were more severely affected than others, as it is the case for France, for Italy, for Spain, for Belgium, and so on and so forth. Now, faced with this challenge, faced with this emergency, EU member states actually agreed on a coordinated action at the external borders. This was based on the Commission recommendation to restrict non-essential travel from third countries to the EU plus area. However, and I believe that this is important for what I'm going to say afterwards about the repatriations, EU citizens who were returning home from third countries were accepted from this travel restriction. So in order to look at the policy measures that were adopted for the diaspora during this pandemic, as I mentioned before, we are going to focus on 2 key dimensions. On the one side, we will briefly discuss about the reaction of the European Union, and on the other side, we are going to discuss as well, using case studies, the responsiveness of national governments. So let's start with the case of the European Union. So at the beginning of the outbreak, it was estimated that around 600,000 EU citizens were actually in need of repatriation due to the travel restrictions that were adopted by different countries and which were, of course, linked to the coronavirus. Most of them were actually in the Asia-Pacific region and in the Americas. It is also estimated that more than 500,000 EU citizens actually were repatriated back to Europe during this period. And this was thanks to the efforts of the diplomatic missions of EU member states, but also the intervention of the European Union in terms of consular cooperation, EU-funded repatriation flights, coordination, and so on. And in terms of timeline, so in March, the High Representative Josep Borrell was tasked to coordinate these repatriation operations of EU citizens, and a special consular task force was actually set up by the European External Action Service, and this task force worked in close cooperation not only with the member states, but also with the Commission. So there was a massive intervention with the aim of repatriating EU citizens who were stranded abroad in these difficult times. You've probably seen it in the media. For instance, this intervention was considered as an illustration of the European solidarity. It was considered as an illustration of European cooperation at its best, in the words of the Commissioner Johannes Hahn in charge of the EU budget. On the 27th of March, Lenarčič, the Commissioner for Crisis Management, also mentioned that the safe return of our citizens is a priority, and we are doing all that we can to ensure that they are reunited with their families as soon as possible during these difficult times. However, Josep Borrell also intervened in order to clarify a little bit who were the ones who were repatriated. So for instance, in this conference from the 23rd of March, he clarified that in the case of repatriations, we are not talking about permanent residents. We have to avoid confusion and to make people believe that all European Union nationals living abroad have to go back to Europe. No, we are just talking about people who are traveling and have been prevented from going back home by the means and the ways they were considering when they started their travel. Now, of course, that the priority for the repatriation was to use commercial flights. However, when this was no longer possible, repatriations were still taking place via the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. You've probably heard about it. So this mechanism has been established in 2001. It was activated several times, but very importantly during the pandemic, it was activated on the 28th of January 2020, following a request from France to help EU nationals who were actually stranded abroad at that time, in particular in Wuhan in China. So according to this mechanism, the European Union actually contributes to the transportation costs for the repatriation of EU nationals who are stranded abroad in third countries. And in general, the European Union contributes with up to 75% of this transportation costs. And how does it work in practice? So basically, the request for assistance is possible when the scale of the crisis exceeds individual member states' response capability, and as I mentioned before, when repatriation is no longer possible via commercial flights. And this is a message from Lenarcic on the 28th of January 2020, when the mechanism was activated following the request of France, saying that the European Union does not forget its citizens' need wherever they are in the world, and that the Emergency Response Coordination Center is working 24/7 and is in constant communication with the member states, with the EU delegation in the region, in this case in China, and the Chinese embassy in Brussels. Now, let's have a look at how many EU citizens were actually repatriated via this Union Civil Protection Mechanism. So this is the data that was made available at the beginning of last week on the 15th of June 2020. And as you can see in here, so up until this date, altogether, slightly more than 85,000 EU citizens were repatriated under the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, out of which around 76,000 were EU citizens. Now, up until mid-June, there were around 343 repatriation flights. As you can see in here, they were departing from different countries all over the world, although it is true that, as we will see in a minute, more repatriation flights were organized from particular countries. And as you can see in this map in here, EU member states also intervene quite differently in terms of organizing repatriation flights. By far, the country that organized most repatriation flights under this mechanism was Germany, with 181 repatriation flights organized up until 15th of June 2020. But then on the other hand, there were some EU member states such as Romania or Bulgaria who did not organize this repatriation. Now, in terms of the timeline of these repatriations that were done under the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, as I said before, altogether there were 343 flights according to the preliminary data that we had up until the 15th of June. And as you can see in here, most repatriations were actually done in the month of March or in the month of April. So for instance, in March, more than 30,000 EU citizens safely returned to Europe via the repatriations under this mechanism, and around 40,000 did so in the month of April. However, the repatriations under this mechanism dropped in the month of May and the beginning of June compared to the previous 2 months. And as I said before, repatriations actually took place from countries all over the world. However, in the second figure in here, we also see that of the total number of 76,000 EU citizens repatriated under this mechanism, more than 10,000 were repatriated from New Zealand, slightly less than 6,000 were repatriated from South Africa, around 5,500 from Peru, and then repatriation flights were also organized from Thailand, India, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Argentina, Philippines, Indonesia, and so on and so forth, the countries listed in here. And in here we have a distribution of the EU citizens repatriated under the Union Civil Protection Mechanism until mid-June by nationality. And we see that from the total number of 76,000 EU citizens repatriated, slightly more than a half, 53%, were German nationals. Germany was also the country, as I said before, that organized more repatriation flights during this, under this mechanism. And they were followed by French citizens, Spaniards, Dutch citizens, Belgians, Austrians, and so on and so forth. There were some specific countries, for instance, we will come back to that later on when we will discuss the case of Cyprus. So for instance, altogether only 10 Cypriots were repatriated under this civil protection mechanism. And now, looking at the countries that mostly repatriated and organized repatriation flights under this mechanism, Germany and France. So in here we have the timeline of their repatriation flights. Germany, as I said before, was the one that organized most flights that returned safely to Europe, around 40,000 German citizens, around 4,000 EU citizens who were nationals of another EU member state, and around 4,000 third country nationals. Non-EU citizens. In the case of Germany, repatriation started under this mechanism on the 1st of February 2020, but we see that most repatriation flights were actually organized in the period between mid-March and mid-May. And in the case of France, we see that France organized less repatriations compared to Germany, but altogether around 7,485 French citizens returned safely back to Europe until the 15th of June. And France, as I said before, was the first one to request this repatriation via the Union Civil Protection. Okay, as I mentioned already, these repatriations were actually framed in terms of European solidarity in bringing people home. As you can see in here, there were many good stories of collaboration between different EU member states, with some member states organizing repatriation flights that help the repatriation of citizens of other EU member states. So for instance, according to the information that was released, Germany has repatriated thousands of citizens from all other EU member states. Belgium repatriated citizens of 20 EU countries, Austria repatriated citizens of 25 EU member states, and so on and so forth. And on the website of the European External Action Service and on their social media, you can also see these, what they call the good stories of consular assistance. So these were cases of repatriations, which were generally labeled on social media under the hashtag We Take You Home, from Uganda, from Cuba, from Guatemala, from Vietnam, etc., etc. And on the website of the European External Action Service, you can also find more information, if you are interested, about the specific consular support that was provided to EU citizens stranded abroad during the pandemic, from practical information on what they have to do and how they have to handle the travel restrictions imposed all over the world, to information on or practical assistance on what they have to do in case they are overstaying their visas while waiting for the return back to Europe. And just to let you know that on the 15th of May, Josep Borrell declared officially mission accomplished regarding these repatriations. And the task force that was led by the European External Action Service has successfully concluded its work in repatriating youth assigned abroad due to the coronavirus travel restrictions. So this is it, more or less, what I wanted to say about the case of the European Union. Now we will briefly move to the responsiveness of national governments. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to take two case studies in particular, on the one side Cyprus and on the other side Romania. So I will start with the case of Cyprus. As I mentioned before, Cyprus is a very interesting case study because it represents one of the EU member states with the highest share of nationals residing abroad. It is generally a country that is labeled as a country of emigration. So in these figures, for instance, we see that by 2017, around 160,000 Cypriots were residing abroad, which represented around 14% of the total population, which is quite a high threshold. And in terms of the top destination countries of the Cypriot diaspora, so we see in here that more than a half of all Cypriots abroad actually reside in two countries in particular, in the UK or in Australia. But then Greece and the US also represent important traditional destinations for Cypriots abroad. Now, unlike many EU member states who were more severely affected by this pandemic, Cyprus registered, at least at the beginning of, with the data at the beginning of last week, less than 1,000 confirmed cases and less than 20 deaths. However, the Cypriot authorities decided to implement travel restrictions quite early, since the beginning of the outbreak in Europe. So travel restrictions were implemented since February 2020. Commercial flights were banned on the 21st of March, and early lockdown measures were announced on the 23rd of March, when the country only reported 116 positive cases. And what has been done for the Cypriot diaspora? So my colleague Angeliki Constantinidou, who I think is joining us for this lecture today, has closely followed the measures that were implemented by the Cypriot authorities in this regard. So the first reaction, which is unsurprising, this is something that was seen also in other EU member states, was to provide information to those who were abroad. So for instance, by the end of February, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Cyprus posted a contact list of all Cypriot diplomatic missions abroad on their website. And 1 month later, they have set up this online platform that is called Connect to Cyprus, which aimed on the one hand to be some sort of communication channel with Cypriots abroad, but on the other hand, it also aimed to provide them with useful information about repatriation options or information or general guidance depending on their needs as well. Repatriation per se was the second most important area of policy intervention for nationals abroad during the pandemic. We do not have the exact numbers, so we don't know exactly from where these repatriations took place, but according to the information, the latest information that was made available by the Press and Information Office of Cyprus, around 7,500 individuals were repatriated until the 25th of May. Now, repatriation via charter flight was announced since mid-March. It initially targeted only the Cypriots who were abroad for medical reasons, for business-related reasons, for short-term stays or official reasons, but later on it got extended in order to cover other categories of Cypriots abroad. The first flights, and also most flights, according to the data that we have retrieved so far, were from the UK. However, these repatriations also happened under rather restrictive conditions, if you wish. So to begin with, the Cypriot Ministry of Health announced that the repatriation would be organized according to the country's capacity to actually receive the ones from abroad, which was estimated, according to the latest information made available, to 2,000 individuals every 15 days. And it was also restrictive in the sense in which only those who had a COVID-19 test, a negative COVID-19 test at the latest 4 days before the flight could actually be repatriated. And once they were repatriated, once returned to Cyprus, they were put in institutionalized quarantine in state-designated facilities. Repatriation also took place from Greece, either directly from Greece or using Greece as a transit country for flights originating from other countries such as Germany. However, so far we couldn't find any information on specific repatriation flights organized from the US or Australia, which represent the two major non-EU destinations of Cypriots abroad. And as I mentioned before, until mid-June, only 10 Cypriots were actually repatriated from third countries via the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. Now, besides repatriations, other measures were also taken for Cypriots abroad. Some of these measures were more symbolic, if you wish, in the sense in which they were intended to keep Cypriots abroad in contact with homeland authorities. For instance, an example in this regard would be the discussions between the Presidential Commissioner chairing the Service for Overseas and Repatriated Cypriots and diaspora representatives. However, other measures were intended to provide more concrete help to those abroad in situation of need. So, just to give you some examples, the Cypriot Ministries of Health and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs helped Cypriots abroad to procure medicine from Cyprus in case this medicine was no longer available in their residence countries. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, via its network of diplomatic missions, also helped to set up a network of healthcare professionals for Cypriots abroad who were in need of healthcare services. Psychological support was also offered to Cypriot students abroad. And regarding the specific case of students, the Cypriot Ministry of Finance also announced the provision of a financial aid of 750 euros for those Cypriot students who were abroad during the pandemic and could not return to Cyprus. And in addition to these general measures that apply technically to all Cypriots residing abroad, specific measures were adopted for Cypriots residing in specific destination countries. In particular, the UK and Greece, the two most important destination countries, European destination countries for Cypriots abroad. So, for instance, in the case of the UK, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Cyprus and the National Federation of Cypriots in the UK sent free boxes with Cypriot food to students. They also provided medical information about medical information or directly medical assistance to those in need, information about how to find accommodation, legal advice if needed, and so on and so forth. And in the case of Greece, for instance, an interesting example comes from the collaboration between the Ministries of Transportation and Education. They arranged for flights that were aiming to assist Cypriot students who initially were repatriated to Cyprus to safely return to Greece and resume their studies in Greek universities. So that's it more or less about the case of Cyprus. Now, in the remaining minutes, we will move on very quickly to the case of Romania. So unlike Cyprus, as I mentioned before, Romania started to witness substantial emigration waves a little bit more recently with the latest emigration wave during the decade of the 2000s. The Romanian diaspora, as we've seen in the graphs that I showed at the beginning, mainly concentrates in other EU member states. So it is estimated that by 2019, more than 3.5 million Romanians were actually living in other EU member states. And in here, you can see the top destination countries, EU destination countries for Romanians abroad: Italy, Spain, Germany, the UK, France, Austria, Belgium, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and so on. Now, unlike in the case of Cyprus, the number of confirmed cases in Romania was much, much higher, estimated at around 22,000 at the beginning of this week. And what has been done for the Romanian diaspora? So just like in the case of Cyprus, the first reaction was to provide information to nationals abroad. So by the end of February, a special section was created on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including information regarding the development of the pandemic and useful guidance for Romanians abroad. And in addition to that, special phone lines were made available on the websites of the diplomatic missions. And regarding phone lines, so since mid-March 2020, a supplementary phone line was made available by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for those Romanians abroad who were facing particularly difficult situation. And the whole idea was to help them identify solutions for their repatriation. And much more recently, only in the month of April, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs collaborated with the Department for Romanians Abroad in order to establish a new platform. It's an online platform called Diaspora Hub, which includes basically information and guidance for Romanians abroad. But the interesting thing is that via this hub, Romanians abroad can actually get personalized recommendations on what to do depending on their specific needs. If they are in need of finding accommodation, if they are in need of being repatriated, if they have any other specific needs. In addition to that, specific measures were taken by the Romanian authorities for particular groups. In this attempt of providing information for Romanians abroad, special information was provided for the seasonal workers. So, for instance, the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection published recently a guide for Romanian workers who intend to go abroad. Information was also provided for Erasmus students, as well as for Romanian drivers, the ones who were in charge of good transportations in Europe. So, for instance, the ministry, in this case, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs engaged in a diplomatic communication to actually facilitate the return of Romanian drivers who were stuck abroad due to blockages in crossing the borders in Europe. And what has been done for the Romanians living in the top destination countries of the Romanian diaspora? As I mentioned before, these were Italy, Spain, Germany, and the UK. So for instance, in the case of, so here I just put some examples. In the case of Italy, quite early since the beginning of the outbreak in Europe, on the 22nd of February, a special task force was created at the embassy, at the Romanian embassy in Rome. This task force collaborated with the Italian authorities in order to provide updated information to Romanians regarding the measures that were taken by the Italian authorities. In other cases, for instance, Spain, Germany, or the UK, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued specific recommendations for Romanians who are working in these countries on the steps that they should follow in case they have any problems with their work contract because of the crisis. And then in some cases, for instance, in the case of Spain or in the case of the UK, specific information was also provided regarding the welfare benefits that Romanian citizens are entitled to from these countries of residence. And in other cases, for instance, in the case of Germany, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs intervened in order to help specific groups. For instance, the farm workers in Bonn, or more recently, diplomatic discussions took place regarding the situation of Romanian seasonal workers in North Rhine-Westphalia, who were, there were some accusations that they were the source of the new infections in this part of Germany. However, repatriation remained, just like in the case of Cyprus, an important measure taken by the Romanian authorities. However, repatriation from the most important destination countries of Romanians abroad happened quite differently, as you can see in here. So most repatriation took place from Spain and from Italy when compared to the UK and Germany. However, the timeline of this repatriation is also different. So most repatriations that took place from Italy were concentrated during the month of March. The repatriation from Spain, most of them started during the month of May or June, so a little bit later. However, according to the data that we have collected so far, more Romanian citizens were repatriated from Spain when compared to Italy. And in both cases, the number of repatriations was much higher when compared to those repatriated from the UK and Germany. In the case of UK and Germany, most repatriations actually took place in the month of June, as you can see in here. And of course, it goes without saying the fact that repatriations of Romanian citizens also were organized from other countries, which were not the 4 countries that I've mentioned before. So here you have a timeline of the repatriation flights according to the information provided by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on their website. So most repatriation took place in the month of May or the beginning of June. Romanians were repatriated from some countries that are also important destinations for them in Europe, such as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, or Austria. But repatriations also took place from some non-European countries, the US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And I will conclude with 2 remarks. So first of all, even though repatriations took place, it was policymakers insisted that Romanians should avoid returning for the Orthodox Easter holidays. So for instance, in here you have the message of the President of Romania, Klaus Iohannis, in a video conference of 19th of March, saying that the Easter holidays are approaching. We must tell them, meaning Romanians abroad, with sadness, but also with sincerity, not to come home for holidays. It is practically impossible to travel in Europe. It's very, very complicated. And when they still return to Romania, according to the current rules, they must go into self-isolation or quarantine. So what's the point of coming in quarantine or solitary confinement for at least 2 weeks? So broadcast on our channels, Romanians abroad are dear to us. We want to see them. We would like to be together, but this year it is not possible. It's sad, but we have to be honest not to create expectations that can come true. And finally, the return of Romanians from abroad, especially those who return from places that had a very high infection rate, also faced certain hostility from Romanians in Romania. And in response to this situation, for instance, here we have a message of the State Secretary for the Department of Romanians Abroad saying that we've noticed with sadness an increase in the public space of messages in which Romanians attack each other for the simpler reason that some live here in Romania, while others who have decided to settle abroad now wish to return home. Instead of being divided, we must understand that in order to overcome this crisis, it is much more important to be united, supportive, and responsible, both to ourselves and to those around us. Romanians in Romania and those returning from abroad want the same thing, to feel safe, to be close to their loved ones. It is often said that Romanians who left Romania did not leave for good conditions. Even now, when they return, they are not returning due to good conditions. It is human that in such moments we all want to be at home, and home is Romania. And then I will actually conclude with this. Normally I have a slide with concluding remarks, but given the fact that this is still an ongoing research, as I mentioned, all the findings that I have shared with you so far are still preliminary findings. I thank you for your attention, and of course I look forward to all your comments and questions. Thank you very much.